talk about the final region of the brain, okay? And that is going to be the cerebellum, okay? The little brain, the mini brain, okay? And there is some similarities between the cerebellum and the cerebrum, right? Like the fact that the cerebrum has two hemispheres. Well, so does the cerebellum, right? The cerebrum had the cerebral cortex. Well, the cerebellum also has its own cortex, okay? But in the cerebrum, we refer to the folds as gyri, right? In the cerebellum, we call them folia. Cerebellar cortex, that's right. Okay? So we don't call them gyri in the cerebellum, we call them folia. Okay? And you know, of course, in the cerebrum, you had all those lobes there. Well, in the cerebellum, you only have two. You have an anterior and a posterior. Okay? And in between each of the hemispheres, there's this structure called the vermis. Okay? The important thing about the vermis, right, is, again, it is going to receive sensory information, all right, from your body, specifically the torso, and it's also going to receive information pertaining to, yes, balance, but proprioception, okay? So that information is going to head to the vermis. So much like the cerebrum, all right, you had the cerebral cortex. Our cerebellar cortex is made up of gray matter on the outside, okay? Then deep to that, the white matter, we learned this in lab. We call that the arbor vitae. And then, again, similar to the cerebrum, all right, where in the white matter, we would have these small pockets of gray matter, right, which we would call cerebral nuclei. Well, in the cerebellum, we call those deep cerebelli nuclei. Cerebellar nuclei. All right, so there's a lot of similarities here, just a couple small differences. This next slide, okay, is you've seen all this material already. Remember when I was going over each part of the brainstem there was one thing in common that each portion of the brainstem had, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. They all had a structure that would connect to the cerebellum, okay? Remember we called those the peduncles, right? You have your superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles. So obviously the midbrain's the superior most structure on the brainstem. So the midbrain is going to be connected to the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle. Right? Yep, I'll go back 1 second, Sean. And then the middle cerebellar peduncle is going to connect the pons to the cerebellum. And then the inferior is going to connect the medulla oblongata. All right? I'm going to come back to this slide here. All right? So just, again, you want to, it's really hard to, there's so much that I want to tell you guys, but this class is only limited. It's not a neuroanatomy class or a neurophysiology class. But it's really important to understand that your brain just has all these awesome, I'm starting to sound like Donald Trump, these are really, really good connections, all right? No, but it has all these wonderful systems and functions, obviously, but it has all these connections. And the important part is because the brain is really I don't want to say fluid organ, but it's a plastic organ, meaning if you were to damage a certain part of it, some of that lost functionality can be made up in other areas, so it can kind of adapt. So your brain has all these different connections. And we see that here with these peduncles here. Remember what I said, the brainstem connects the other three regions of the brain to one another, but also, importantly, it connects it to the spinal cord so we can get to the body, okay? So one of my favorite things to talk about the cerebellum is all the functions. Now here's the first thing. There's a whole bunch of bullet points on here, but here's what you really need to get away from this slide with. Right? The cerebellum coordinates and fine-tunes movements. That's its job. It's to make sure that whatever movements that you're doing, especially if it's a movement of skill, like playing the piano or maybe juggling, right, or surgery, okay, anything, right, it helps to fine-tune those movements, especially movements that really require dexterity, okay? So you've heard the saying, practice makes perfect. You need to kick that saying to the curb, because you could practice something wrong. It ain't perfect, but perfect practice makes perfect. So that's the important thing. And again, what that means is you're creating what we call, you've heard the term muscle memory maybe. Basically, you're creating pathways, okay? And the more you do it, and we'll talk about this when we get to encoding and memory making, but you're just going to keep using this pathway, and you make it more of a permanent pathway. Because, again, I've said this before, I think last class, if you don't use it, you lose it type of thing. If you don't use something, like if you haven't played the piano in 30 years, you're not going to be as adept or as good at it as you were when you were playing at your peak, all right? So it's one of those things that what the cerebellum does is it helps you to, and guides your movements, your certain muscle movements, into fine-tuning things, and then it analyzes what you're trying to do, and then it makes corrective feedback to it to try to improve it. So the big thing is it helps to correct the pattern, okay? And it also stores memories. Well, guess what? That's awesome. So now here's another place in your central nervous system that you can store muscle memory. Okay? Remember, you've got your primary motor cortex, and then you've got the prefrontal motor cortex, which is that gyrus that's right in front of your primary motor cortex, where we store a bunch of our motor memory. And now we've got another place to store some of our motor memory. All right? So it is actually going to affect both voluntary and involuntary motor movements. Okay? So, like, obviously, when you're writing there, that's voluntary motor movements. Like when I was saying, when I showed you that stork stand, when I was standing on one leg, all right? I'm trying to keep balance there. That's going to be the involuntary motor movements, the corrective. My body's going to shift itself and try to stabilize certain muscles so I can keep that position there. So it is going to make, like I was saying, that corrective feedback or adjust the movements here, right? Basically making things nice and smooth. Ever seen a basketball player, a professional basketball player, take a jump shot? That is a practice movement. And they make it look so beautiful and so sweet only because, well, one, they have wonderful muscle memory in regards to that, but they have their cerebellum that is helping to make those movements fluid and smooth, okay? So the cerebellum, all right, plays a big role when it comes to balance, equilibrium, okay, and even posture, okay? So, like I said, those proprioceptive receptors that are located all in those muscles and joints are going to send their information, that proprioceptive information, from those muscles and joints, wherever they're being utilized, up to your cerebellum, and your cerebellum is going to then tweak that information, all right, through not only sensory feedback, but motor feedback, okay? So we consider that an error-correcting mechanism, right, that will then send this information, okay, that the cerebellum has gotten from your proprioceptors in your joints, sends it to the cerebellum. The cerebellum processes it, analyzes it, looks it over and says, okay, let me make some tweaks here, and then it sends that information up to the motor cortex, the premotor cortex. I'll show you a picture. Hold on.
That's why if you're like leaning on your right leg, it doesn't feel as comfortable as leaning on the left leg or vice versa.
It depends. I mean, when you say like when you're
like you're
standing.
Just standing up. Like for me, an example, in surgery, when I lean on my right side, it's more comfortable. But when I try to lean on my left, it seems like my feet hurt, or my body wants to slittle back to the right.
Part of that is muscle memory. You have pretty much programmed yourself to be like that. And so now you have conditioned those muscles and created those pathways that feels more comfortable for you. You're not stimulating certain proprioceptors. Now, this picture here could be somewhat daunting when you look at it first, but this is basically explaining these cerebellar pathways here. And I want to kind of zoom out a little bit. Okay. So basically what we're seeing here, okay? So going through the colors, you got voluntary movements, assessment of the voluntary movements, integration and analysis, and corrective feedback. Right? So initially, when you make some sort of voluntary movement, right, something that's going to take skill, juggling, let's say, okay? So you're going to initiate that information. It's going to come from your primary motor cortex and your prefrontal motor cortex, okay, when you start to juggle. So obviously that motor information is going to travel down your spinal cord out to the muscles that you're going to use, okay? So as you're juggling and moving things around, you start to drop things. You're like, what the heck, man? You keep practicing, your body makes adaptations. Well, as I'm moving my arms around, okay, and trying to accommodate, like when I'm watching where the juggling sacks are going to land, right? And as I start to get into that pattern now where I get the flow or the feeling, proprioceptors, okay, from the joints and the muscles in my upper extremities are going to be sending information up to the cerebellum. Right? It's going to get into the cerebellum, and then it's going to process and analyze that information. And it's going to be like, okay, well, instead of throwing the sack, too high, now I start to throw it less high so I can catch it more often. So to increase the success, it analyzes that information, then it's going to interpret it, and then it's going to send, all right, its corrective information up to the primary motor cortex to make adjustments to fine-tune that movement. Same thing like when you're practicing to kick a soccer ball or take a jump shot. I know I'm using sports a lot, whatever. Playing the piano, all right, all that. If you keep striking the wrong key, eventually when you're learning, or playing the guitar, you're going to eventually get better because of that corrective feedback, and it's going to send that information from the cerebellum up to the primary motor cortex. Then you can, same thing, loop it back down through the voluntary movement. So it's a constant kind of feedback loop, right? Just showing as you get better at it, you start to form those more permanent pathways. So you play the piano better, you kick the soccer ball better, you can juggle better. All right, it's all involved with those cerebellar pathways there. So, I don't want to give you folks the wrong impression because I've never been pulled over for drinking and driving. They haven't caught me yet. No, I'm just kidding. I just don't. All right, I don't do that. But when they pull people over to do a roadside sobriety test, they're testing your cerebellum. That's what they're doing because alcohol affects the cerebellum. Okay, balance and equilibrium. So, and I've seen, is it called Bridesmaid? With has anyone ever seen the movie Bridesmaids? With what's her name?
My favorite.
What's her name?
Kristen Wiig. Thank
you, Kristen Wiig. I'm going to tell you guys something, and you can say whatever you want about me. She went to my high school. She was 2 years. I'm aging myself. She was in between my brother and I. My brother's 2 years older than me, so she was a year ahead of me. Kristen Wiig. She was on Saturday Night Live. Check it out. Tell me. I don't know if it'll tell her high school, but if it said, tell me where it says she's from. Anyways, there's a scene in the movie in which I think it's that movie where somebody gets pulled over and and then I think they make her walk the line, and that's called they make you toe the line, walk heel toe, one in front of the other. If you're unable to keep balance when you're doing that, it's called ataxia. That is a cerebellar. That's it. Brighton High School, Rochester, New York, Brighton, New York. Yep. That was my second high school that I went to. Which is the biggest joke in the world. I'm telling you what. Yeah. Yeah. You can't, yeah. And well, a lot of times what they'll do too is they'll say, all right, put your arms out to your sides, close your eyes, then touch your finger to your nose and then bring it back. Or they'll stand in front of you. They'll say, okay, touch my finger with your finger. So you touch your finger to their finger, then they'll move it to a different area. It's called pass pointing if you miss. But these are all cerebellar movements. There's another one called dysdiokinesia, which you alternate tapping your hands on your legs, and you alternate palms up, palms down each time. Right? If you had a cerebellar lesion, you wouldn't be able to do it. You'd be flopping around and kind of messing everything up. Okay? So what we're seeing is, you know, when you're getting a roadside sobriety test, they're testing your cerebellum, but they're testing, right, your equilibrium, your balance, your ability to control fine motor movements and coordinate fine motor movements. And obviously, drugs and alcohol can impair that. All right, let's get on to the limbic system, emotions. All right, emotions. Messing with my money is like messing with my emotions. Smokey, right? My favorite lines, one of my favorite movies. All right. Said she looked like Janet Jackson, got up out of that car looking more like Freddie Jackson. All right, I'm done. I'm done with the movie, folks. All right. All right. Okay, so limbic system, emotions, all right, the emotional brain. Wait, what? Emotion. Emotion. Sorry. No. Emotions. All right. Okay. So when we're talking about the limbic system, there are several components to the limbic system. So I'm going to talk about some of them briefly here. All right. But keep in mind that the emotional brain, all right, is going to be found in several different regions of the brain. Okay. So when we talk about some of these structures here, you're going to see what I'm talking about. The first one is the cingulate gyrus. Okay. Now this is found above the corpus callosum. I'm going to come back. I just want to show you this real quick. Here's a picture, right, of the limbic system. Okay, all these structures here. Okay, this is the corpus callosum. Right above it is the cingulate gyrus here. Okay, right here. Okay. All right. So we have a structure called the perihippocampal gyrus, right, which is also going to do with what we call the hippocampus. Let me show you this real quick. I'll get into some of the structures here, or what they do. All right. So here is, okay, perihippocampal gyrus, right? And then we've got the hippocampus, which is right here. And inside the perihippocampal gyrus, we have this other structure, which I'll talk about momentarily, called the amygdaloid body, okay, or the amygdala, okay, right in here. Okay? All right. I just wanted to show you that. Okay. So, perihippocampal gyrus, all right, that structure is going to have to do with emotions and transmissions of certain primate-like emotions like fear, pleasure, but also it is going to be a structure that helps with the hippocampus with memory, okay? So one thing out of this slide that I need you to understand is that the hippocampus has to do with forming long-term memories. If you damage this structure, you will have a very difficult time forming long-term memories. Okay? Watch the movie Memento if you're not sure what I'm talking about. Okay? Guy Pearce. I don't remember the year. But it has to do with a man that had brain damage and he could only remember 24 hours. Every morning when he woke up, I thought, short-term memories. The hippocampus. Yes. No. Well, yeah, but you need the hippocampus. No, the hippocampus is going to be for your long-term memories. Okay. All right. Next structure, the amygdaloid body. Okay. The amygdaloid body, all right, has to do with emotional responses. And the big one is one of the more powerful ones. And this, again, you can get into discussions with psychology majors. Fear is one of the most important emotions that you can have because, one, it can save your life. Right? You can run a heck of a lot faster when you're scared for your life than when you're happy and gleeful. All right? So the amygdaloid body right, has to do with, right, the different types and aspects of emotions that you experience, but also emotional memory. So like when you're watching a movie, you're like, I hate watching this movie, it makes me sad, right? You're actually stimulating the amygdaloid body and that emotional memory, okay? Especially when we're dealing with fear. Crazy thing that happens, if you lesion the amygdaloid body, you will have very, very outrageous emotional outbursts, right? But also, for whatever reason, you'll have very strange sexual behaviors. Yeah, I know. I know. And again, a lot of it has to do with how the limbic system is kind of wired within itself. But trying again, and when I learned that when I was taking neuro, if you remove it, if anything, if you damage it, if you remove it, yeah, you'll have.
What do you mean
Wait,
weird? I mean, I just know this because I work in a hospital. Like pooping on people, enjoying that type of sexual arousement.
Very aggressive sexual behaviors.
BDSM.
Like to the point where you
Yeah.
I mean, it's to the point where people are going to be like, my neuroanatomy teacher described it as having a monkey jump on your back that won't get off. That's how he put it. And I don't know, I never heard that term before. You know, I've heard monkey on your back, but. Well, if they're having those weird activities.
This reminds me of Black Mirror. Somebody like a psychopath, their anatomy probably looks different.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, possibly. I mean, it really depends. I mean, but there's also the aspect of the frontal lobe too, because there could be issues there. You know, there could be damage and problem. But I mean, again, anytime you're involving the limbic system, because the limbic system has a lot of it's got its hands in a lot of different other regions of the brain because it connects a lot of different regions of the brain. And I mean, perfect example, look at this next part here. Olfactory bulbs, olfactory tracts, and olfactory cortex. All of those are tied into the, like when I was describing to you earlier about the habenular nuclei, you're driving by and you smell something and you're like, oh yeah, grandma's cooking, This is all affected by it. And we'll discuss more. Actually, we'll find all these structures here that I mentioned, but they're all over the inferior portion of the frontal lobe, right? And it moves throughout part of the temporal lobe also, but it's spread out. The fornix, easy. Fornix is, I know you do, Sean. Brain is a marvelous thing. The fornix connects a lot of these other structures, right, or regions of the brain into the limbic system. So just think, right, that the fornix is going to connect, all right, mainly the hippocampus, okay, and it's going to connect the hippocampus to these other limbic structures. Now remember, the hippocampus helps with making long-term memories, okay? So how I remember the fornix when I was learning this is just a structure that helps to connect other regions of the limbic system to the area of the limbic system that helps with long-term memories. All right, and again, we're not going to get into it, well, because we don't have the time, but all these different nuclei, you can see all these different nuclei listed here. Here's the annular nuclei like I was telling you about, all right? That is going to be mixed into the limbic system that is going to help contribute to some of these processes here. All right, reticular formation. I briefly mentioned this earlier when we were going over the brainstem, okay? The reticular formation has two components, okay? But it is made up of gray matter, okay, which means a lot of cell bodies, a lot of dendrites, a lot of synapses, okay, a lot of unmyelinated axons, all right? The motor component is basically going to have to do with muscle tone. You guys remember muscle tone, right? Remember like how muscles feel when you're doing what you're doing right now, okay? All right, because remember I gave the example, did I give this section the example? Like you're sitting there minding your own business and someone puts their hands on your shoulders and starts massaging your traps, your trapezius muscle. They're like, oh, you're tight, okay? Muscle tone, it comes from just random action potentials being discharged through the motor neurons that will facilitate, all right, the muscles to contract but not to create any movement. That's what muscle tone is. No type, I shouldn't even say contraction. It's going to stimulate the muscles, all right, but you're not going to have any movement from that, okay? Yeah, maybe so. Hey, weirdo, do I even know you? All right. So you have the motor component, which has to do with muscle tone. And then you've got the sensory component. And when we're talking about the sensory component, we call that the reticular activating system, all right, or the RAS. And that has to do with alertness. Okay. And so what is alertness? All right. It's your ability to process sensory information, all right, and as it enters into your cerebral cortex, to determine, your response to that sensory stimulation. Perfect example. All right, there's the alarm clock there. That if it rouses you or wakes you up. If you see something, all right, a visual stimulus could do the same thing. If you see a train barreling at you, all right, it's going to stimulate a certain level of awareness going on. Okay. So when we're talking about alertness, we're talking about the consciousness or the conscious sensations that you're perceiving, right? Touch, all right? We're not talking, it doesn't have to be an auditory sensation. It could be a visual sensation. It could be a touch sensation. It can be did I say auditory? Yeah, I'm not going to say taste sensation, all right? Unless something tastes really bad, all right? So this is when we talk about alertness, the sensory component, the reticular activating system is going to deal with that. Perfect example. This is kind of what I was trying to get at. All right. Visual stimuli, auditory stimuli, all that information is going to travel into your reticular activating system there. All right, the RAS. Then from there, all right, that information is going to ascend to the thalamus and then up into the specific cerebral area there. If it's an auditory or if it's a visual sensation or stimulus, it's going to go to the occipital lobe. Okay. If it's auditory, it's going to go to the temporal lobe. All right. But this reticular activation system, all right, is going, depending on what type of stimulus, is going to dictate your alertness and response to something. Okay. All right. So let's talk about that, by the way. All right, the different levels or the pathological states. We talked about consciousness, that your level of alertness. Now let's talk about the opposite, your levels of non-alertness or unconsciousness. All right, the most mild one is fainting. Has anyone here ever fainted? Yeah, all right, I have too. Some jerk in my sophomore year of high school decided to pull my hair back as I was stretching and then cut off blood flow to my brain temporarily for a quick second, and I passed out. I was back. I mean, I was back. Oh my gosh. No, I never had a rat tail, for the record, never. I had a sweet buzz cut, flat top. Oh yeah, that was hardcore. So anyways, fainting, all right, most of the time it's due to decreased blood flow to your brain. Perfect example. You ever stood up real fast, you get a little bit lightheaded, your body's able to compensate for that. But some people, if they stand up fast enough, usually in older folks, their vasomotor control center there in the medulla oblongata can't regulate blood flow quick enough, and sometimes they can pass out. So that's what happens, right? Blood pressure gets real low because your body doesn't have enough time to compensate for it, and you pass out for a brief period of time. No problem. That's fainting. All right, stupor, right? This is where you see in a movie where somebody's out cold and someone takes like a smelling salt and puts it under their nose or slaps their hand really loud, right? And they wake up, they revive them or whatever, right? That's a stupor, right? And that is an extreme stimuli is required to arouse them out of that state, okay? Now, what are some of the causes, okay? Well, usually when I've seen it in movies, it's brain trauma. Someone gets knocked out over the head, then another guy comes in there. Hey, wake up, Johnny. Okay. Metabolic disorders, we see it all the time. Right? And in some cases, that could be a result of kidney disease or liver disease. Right? But most times, We talk about stupor, drug use. Okay, that's one of the causes. Coma, we're familiar with that. I think we've all watched enough soap operas where Cindy was in a coma for 6 months, and then she comes out of it and finds out that her husband is married to her sister or something, you know, whatever, right? Twin sister, yeah, twin sister. All right? But in this situation, this person is in a deep state, all right, a deep state of unconsciousness, and they're unresponsive. You could yell at them all day long. Now, there's the argument. Well, when you talk to somebody that's in a coma, does that do anything? Being in the room, holding their hand or whatever, you're still stimulating, all right, their nervous system when you hold their hand or whatever, when you talk to them, okay? But it's not going to bring them out of the coma, okay? Okay. So again, similar type of situation. We're talking about the causes, right? It could be brain trauma or head injury. Again, some sort of metabolic condition that causes that, right? A stroke, right? Low blood sugar. For those of you that deal with anybody that's that has diabetes, especially type 1 diabetes, they get that diabetic coma. That blood sugar drops down low. Boom, it can go out. And then sometimes you have the medically induced coma. All right, in certain situations that they actually have to give you some drugs to actually put you into coma, okay? Then finally, the last one here is the persistent vegetative state, right? Which when I was a little kid, we used to call them the vegetables, but these folks are, for all intents and purposes, all right, technically dead, right? Brain dead, all right? The only brain functions, I shouldn't say the only brain functions, all right, but are the actual brain activity to keep your vital systems working. Pardon? The bit. Oh, the bent farm. Good. Oh, I thought you were going to say the good place. So in this situation, right, these folks have no conscious thought, no sense of awareness going on. All right, it's just what we refer to as non-cognitive brain functions, right? Basic functions to keep all the tissue in your body essentially alive. Okay.
So when someone's brain dead or in a vegetative state, can they come back from that or not?
That's so funny you say that, because I had a conversation before I came into class today with a colleague of mine out in the parking lot. She rattled off 3 situations in which she knows or heard a story. She had one family member and then 2 other family members that told her of these other people that were in persistent vegetative states and came out of them. Now, whether or not they come back and are the same person cognitively, she didn't answer that question. She said one kind of did, but it wasn't, you know, she wasn't very specific. They came out of it. That was very extreme. I've never heard of it up until that. Yeah. Because that's what our conversation was about. I told her, I said, if that happens to me, I'm telling them to pull the plug on me.
Give me a month if I ain't that.
Well, then she told me these 3 stories. Like one person, they let their loved one live in this state for 15 years.
15 years? Do you know how much big that medical bills are?
I know. Well, they took care of this person, cleaned them, everything. I mean, they were 15 years. That's love, but I mean.
Selfish love. I don't think I would want.
I hear you. Yeah, I know. That's why I say pull the plug on me. All right. Higher order mental functions, and I feel bad. I should have put this in earlier on in the slideshow when I first started doing this, because a lot of folks, you know, you'll hear me mention higher order mental functions. And basically, that's learning, memory, reasoning. Okay. Those, when you hear me say higher order mental functions, those are what I'm referring to. All right. As you know, it happens up in the gray matter in the cerebral cortex. Okay. And these functions, and we've already learned about memory, okay? We learned that muscle memory, for example, occurs in the frontal lobe, in the primary motor cortex, the pre-motor cortex, and then also in the cerebellum, okay? So that's what we refer to multiple brain regions, okay? That includes conscious and unconscious processing. We'll talk about the unconscious processing more when we talk about memory and encoding and all that, okay? All right, let me finish up with sleep, and then we'll call it a night, all right? Because everybody needs to get a good night's sleep, especially if you're going to be taking a test soon. All right, so sleep. something that is often craved, but we never get enough of. And I know there's a riddle regarding sleep in regards to what are you always in short supply of? I don't know. It was a good riddle, and I wish I could remember. I'm horrible with riddles. But anyways, okay, in sleep, obviously, you are in a brief period, a temporary period of unconsciousness or absence of consciousness, right? So what I kind of think of when you're sleeping, this is the time when your body is taking that opportunity to repair yourself, okay? So there's damage to tissues. Also to replenish any energy supplies like recycling ATP and all that, okay, and increasing your glycogen levels. But I don't even know if they have this function on computers anymore. Anyone here remember disk defragmentation? Did you guys ever do that? It's an old function in which what you would do is consolidate the memory in your RAM, which is the random access memory. It's part of the CPU, okay? And normally when you put programs on your computer just kind of randomly, even though it looks like it's organized on the screen there, in the CPU, in the central processing unit, the brain of your computer, it just randomly places it in areas. Well, what this program did, not a program, but it was a function, it would consolidate and take those randomized pieces and put them into chunks and blocks. So it kind of organized things. Well, that's what happens with sleep, right? So when you're sleeping, all right, yes, all right, your cortical activity is lower functioning than it is now. I mean, our cortical activity should be pretty high now as we're sitting here learning, okay? But when you're sleeping, all right, it's diminished, it's decreased. All your vital functions are still gangbusters. They're still going. Like, obviously, your heart's got to beat, your lungs got to breathe, your digestive system's got to digest, right? All that's still going, right? But your cortical activity becomes decreased. So there's two stages of sleep. You got non-REM, which is where you spend the majority of your sleep, about 75%. And this is where you just kind of rest and recover, right? So where you do a lot of growth, you'll talk about this when you do the endocrine system, you talk about growth hormone, all right? So this is where, when we were talking about in chapter 10, all right, when you do that oxygen debt and you're trying to reload all your glycogen levels to restore your skeletal muscle glycogen levels, that occurs a lot when you're sleeping, okay? So the other stage of sleep is REM, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard that. It stands for rapid eye movement, okay? And you only spend about a quarter, about 25% of your night's sleep in REM, sometimes even less, okay? And this is where you dream, okay? Or what we refer to as memorable dreaming, meaning, hey, I can remember my dream. If you can't remember your dreams, probably a good chance that you're not getting enough REM sleep. Now, as you get older too, it's harder to remember your dreams also. I love dreams, especially flying dreams. But this is where you do your disk defragmentation. Right? This is where you consolidate those memories. And it's important, this is one of the reasons why it's very important to get a good night's rest the night before a test. Okay? Because all that information that you've reviewed, hopefully you've learned it all that information that you reviewed, all right, that's when your brain is going to start to consolidate it and put it, package it away, so when you go and take your test or do whatever with those memories, you can access them much more easily, okay? So that's why it's important to get, as an adult, 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. An Olympic athlete requires 8 hours of sleep, okay? Neither do I. I wish. Now, infants, they need a lot of sleep, okay? You guys should get 7 to 8 hours of sleep. Infants need about 17 to 18 hours. Teenagers, preteens need about 8.5 to 9 hours of sleep. And I truly do believe that. And in some school districts, they have started to, not down here as far as I know, but up in New York, they started schools, middle school and high schools later. They were even talking about going as late as 10 o'clock, but most people are like, oh, heck no, you can't do that. No. Well, I know it's 8:45 for some of the high schools. They were talking. I'm talking about later than that, like 9 o'clock. There was, yeah. Yeah.
Something like that. I had to be there at 7:15 where I'm from. So.
Yeah. Well, they were trying to, and the big reason they ran into some resistance in some school districts is the school bus. You know, the school buses, because then you'd have to run all the school buses twice. One for the younger kids, and then once for, and it just wasn't financially. But it's supposed to be better. But this is the part that you guys should be really paying attention to. Lack of sleep, obviously, is unhealthy. We all know that. But why? Depression, poor memory, but here's the big one. Poor immune function. That's some serious stuff, especially nowadays with COVID running around. We're in the flu and cold season. You can't compromise your immune system. That's true, and part of that will play into your circadian rhythms and that melatonin release. So obviously, as you get older, you might have suffered from this guy right here, insomnia. Okay, so insomnia is just difficulty falling and staying asleep. All right, and I see a lot of this because I do DOT medical physical exams. So if you want to get your commercial driver's license, you got to come talk. Well, you don't have to come talk to me, but you have to see a medical examiner. And if you have sleep apnea, that's basically when you have an interruption in your sleep. Now, it could be from you could stop breathing. Some people can stop breathing for as long as almost 30 seconds. Sleep apnea is no joke because it takes years off your life. But one of the ways to treat sleep apnea is through what we call a CPAP machine, and that just creates a positive pressure in which they basically force air into you so you can breathe. Yeah, exactly. I know. Trust me. And I mean, an early way of knowing that someone could possibly have sleep apnea is, that's right, snoring. Snoring. Yep. Raining, it's pouring, the old man is snoring, you know, that kind of thing. It's maybe because he has sleep apnea. And so we need to get him a sleep test because it takes years off your life. So anyways, that's it for me. When we come back, we will talk about cognition and what all that is and memory. And then we'll wrap up with amnesia.
What is it called when you just fall asleep, you know, like?
Narcolepsy.
I really think I got that.
Have you ever fallen asleep driving?
Yes. Like if
in the middle of the day?
And I'm like, I know y'all mothers taught me I love to talk. If I get anywhere quiet enough, I could have 12 hours of sleep. I would go to sleep. I can do that in surgery. Like my surgeons are just like, when I'm holding retractors, they're like, I don't care as long as you're holding a retractor. I'll be standing there like this sleep.
I think you just